on earth do we start?
I don't know, you pick somewhere. The beginning?
Why did you decide to write a book? Why did you decide to write a thriller specifically? And did you think you had it in you?
I think that the answer to the first question is that unless you're extraordinarily successful, filmmaking or television is a collaborative effort. And I got to the point where the collaboration was grating a bit. I just was making Treasure Island for Sky and NBC, and Eddie Izzard, who was playing Long John Silver, shaved his head and decided he wanted Maori tattoos on his head, and it looked great. And then some guy at NBC rings up and says, we don't like the tattoos on his head. And I went, no, you got this wrong. If you want to say that, then you've got to sit here and I'll sit behind your desk. And I went, this is no fun anymore. I mean, so the least collaborative thing that you can do is write a book. So very stupidly, I said, it's a piece of cake. I could write a book. And after tearing hair out and pulling my nails out and everything else, it took quite a while to do it. But it was fun. And also it gave me enormous respect for all the writers that I'd given a bad time to, who used to say, you can just change that scene in 20 minutes, can you, because we're going to reshoot it differently. And then, it's a cliche, but it's true. Write what you know, or if you don't know it, be very good at making it up. So I knew a bit about making television. The book itself, which we'll get to later, but it has a quite strong, true historical narrative, and I liked history. And it just seemed like a good thing to do, and I sat down one day and started writing, and that was it.
You say that the least collaborative thing you can do is writing a novel, but actually you have to collaborate with a literary agent, you have to collaborate with an editor. Were there battles?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right, and I had no idea how collaborative it had to be, and my beloved wife spends most of her waking hours on Twitter and this. And
she's a very good publicist.
She's very good at it, yeah. Don't tell her, because she'll ask me to be paid. But the truth of the matter, I had no idea of the difficulty that it takes to promote yourself. The publishers are, obviously they concentrate on well-established brands, and you really have to do it yourself, which is why I'm thrilled that I'm here. I have to pinch myself.
You did get a very good write-up by a fellow ginger.
Oh, yeah?
Damian Lewis.
Wrong Damian Lewis.
Oh, no. Was it?
Yeah.
Is it an E rather than an A?
Yes. That Damian Lewis actually is as legendary in the book world as the Ranger is in the film world. He writes SAS books, and a lot of them. And he gave a very nice. But next time I see Damian Lewis with whichever way around is, I will thank him and say thank you for the review.
Did you enjoy the actual process of writing it? And tell us how much of what ended up on paper did you kind of know would end up on paper when you started it? How much of it was planned out, and how much fun did you have in the process and surprising yourself, perhaps?
Yeah, some of it was nails down a blackboard as opposed to fun. I had a very rough idea of what the story was. And when it comes to script writing, you normally set out the scenes that you're going to write and the salient points, and you lay that out on a blackboard, actually. And I couldn't do it with that, because I had no idea really where the story was going, and my mantra was always keep the reader hooked and throw in the least expected thing that the reader would expect, if you see what I mean. And that became very trying after a while, because if you do a dogleg on the storyline, you better have a very good reason for doing it. And that's literally how I did it. I had a very rough idea, and I started writing in it. I mean, I talk far too much, as you can tell, but it's very interesting, the difference between writing a book and a screenplay, in that a screenplay, until 20 years ago, was always broken down into what they call the three-act paradigm. And the first act, the three-act paradigm, is usually quite short. It can cover an enormous expanse of time, and it is getting the character to the bottom of the tree, if you see what I mean. So it's really the setup. The second act paradigm is the guy climbing the tree. So it's actually the bulk of the story. That time frame is more compressed. And then the third act paradigm is the guy jumping out of the tree, and that is usually always present time and always linear. And that's basically how every movie you've ever seen is broken up. And essentially what the writers do is they take the scenes from Act 1 paradigm, Act 2 of the paradigm, Act 3, they put them on a blackboard and they move them around. And that's how they jiggle around time frame, and that's how you get stories crossing over. Until Tarantino came along, and Tarantino went, sod that, I'm going to take the scene from the end of the third act in
Pulp Fiction?
In Pulp Fiction, which is the Honey Bunny scene, when the two of them are sitting in the restaurant and are about to shoot it up. And that's actually the last scene of the film. And he took it from the third act paradigm and put it at the beginning of the first.
And then you had Memento as well, didn't you?
That went back. That was even more confusing. Memento was getting a little difficult at my age to try and get my head around. But so those are film techniques. Writing a book is you still are very aware of a linear path through it.
But I got the sense, reading this, that there's a lot of the screenwriter, the filmmaker, in you as the author here. I mean, just take for example, the opening scene. And I interviewed M.N.Grenside the other day, the Booker-winning author. Yeah. He said he, I think, was moving towards the idea that, if he hasn't already, that endings are perhaps more important than beginnings. But the beginning of the book really sort of picks you up and shakes you. Yeah. And it's very scenic. It's very filmic. You can imagine it being shot as a movie.
Good, that's kind of you. I just think
but it's shocking as
the
well.
Producer who optioned it, we should ring him up and tell him. But going back to that cliche, write what you know. Well, I know about visual media, so that's kind of what you said. But yes, I do write. I try and write it visually as if I was seeing it as a film. And the second thing that I did, which is a little different from a lot of novels, is that dialogue, first of all, dialogue is incredibly difficult to write, because as soon as you write it, it's not how somebody's spoken. So it takes forever to change written dialogue into screenplay dialogue. But the tip that I always used from a very well-known screenwriter on film is always enter the scene as late as possible. You should always enter the scene just at the denouement or just before it. And I tried to do that on that. So you got rid of the faff, if you see what I mean, setting up a scene. You should have in the run up to it in the chapter before set up what was about to happen, and what then happens is you're into the scene as it's happening. Does that make any sense?
So there's a lot of meta stuff going on in this book. I mean, you're a screenwriter. A screenwriter is murdered. There are clues within the film that he's written that are sort of real and real life. Yeah. Explain how you managed to juggle those different threads and how personally you were involved in it, given that you're writing about stuff that you know.
That I know. For those who don't know, which... thank you all my friends for turning up. But for those who don't know, the actual book itself, I don't want to go into it too much because I'll give too much away, but essentially it's the story of a screenwriter who finishes a screenplay and is murdered, but before he's killed, the screenplay, before it goes to his agent, goes out to 5 very specific people, all of whom had worked on a movie 25 years before that had stopped shooting. And inside the script that he's written, actually are clues to the story as to why that film stopped shooting. And it's locked into quite a lot of history. It may not seem it when you start the book. You think it's something, very modern day, and there must be some reason for it. But actually, it's a big hidden story. So I had 3 major timelines going on. I had one timeline from the 1940s, one timeline from the 1960s to 1970s, and one modern timeline. And the only way you can juggle that is that you have to have linear in your mind, and it's then you break them up to intersperse with the different timelines. Do you see if you see what I mean? But you have to be absolutely clear and focused what is going on in each of those timelines, and then the fun, the skill, the joy of writing is being able to plait, in that case, as it's 3, plait all those timelines together without giving away the wrong clues at the wrong time and all of that nonsense. That drives you nuts. I mean, that drives you completely crazy. When you start moving scenes around, you suddenly go, oh God, I needed that clue there, and I can't
Did
have
sometimes
it.
One or two of the threads feel like they were unravelling, or slightly out of your reach or your control?
Yeah. Worse than that. It's more like, when you snag a jersey and you're moving backwards and the whole thing starts unravelling.
Having written the book, do you feel now, and you're writing a second book, do you feel that you could do anything? Like you now know the basic rules, that you've survived in the shark-infested waters of writing a first novel, and that a second book is easier? Because, of course, for some people, when they write their first book, they feel a terrible pressure to write the second, and for it to be as good as, or to be as well received as the first.
Well, obviously, you always try and entertain people. The process is some people have huge joy in writing. Funnily enough, I loathe the writing process, but I absolutely adore the editing process. To write a second book, yes, there was pressure and everything else. Is it going to be as good? I mean, who knows? I didn't even know if the first one was going to be any good. I'm still not sure if it is, but some people have enjoyed it, which is great. But, I think there's always pressure to be... I think there's a line in the book, nothing's original, it's just nobody's noticed it, you've stolen it from somebody else. I think, if you're writing this kind of genre of thriller and you're trying to make it original, that's the hardest thing. It's the cliche of the thriller you've got to move away from.
Sometimes you don't even know that you've taken something from someone else, because in a way, everything we absorb, don't we, through the course of our life.
Of course. I mean, again, I think it says in there, there's a love scene between the 2 protagonists, and he tells her there are only 5 movies, which is true. I can't remember what they were now, but I remember researching.
One of them is Joe Root's captaincy of the England cricket team.
Yeah, well, I think that's slaying the dragon. But
one of the things I was fascinated by is the way that you jump around from scene to scene, but from location to location. And again, I can see the filmmaker and the screenwriter in that. I mean, we're in the Philippines early on, but we go to Switzerland, we go to Cannes, we're in America. That's quite exciting. And I've always been rather proud of the fact that I've visited or been to 84 countries. And I read up about you, and you've been, I think, to 119.
Yeah, 119
I mean,
countries.
how do you manage that? And did it help you as a writer?
Yeah.
To set something in so many different locations?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I specifically chose a couple of locations that people don't normally see, and certainly in the next book, the locations are the Aleutian Islands, which is that sort of string of pearls between Alaska and Russia, and Malta. Obviously, I live in Malta, but they're not locations that you normally look at when you go the Aleutian Islands, and hopefully that makes people interested in the book. In terms of my travel, I mean, I travelled all over the world all the time, either there was a time I owned a network. I bought the Hallmark Channel, and that was in Umpty Dumpty countries around the world. I can't even remember now. And I would go and visit them. And then there were times when I was shooting movies in parts of the world. So I went there a lot. And then actually I enjoy it. I really love going. I still haven't been to Antarctica, which I want to go to. But there are not many after that I haven't been to.
What is the country that has been most different to what you're used to in your life?
That's a very difficult question, because there are differences in countries you go to that are all about, they can be about religion, they can be about standard of living, they can be about weather. Now those are big, big differences, but they're differences because they are physical differences. Probably the country that is the most interesting is Japan, because Japan is a Western civilized country with a standard of living that is either above ours or the same of ours, and yet there are no cultural reference points. Absolutely none. I mean, I love New Zealand and I love going to Vietnam, and lots and lots of things, and there are lots of reasons I like that. But the one that slaps you in the face is Japan.
And sometimes you get slapped in the face by differences within a country. I've just back from South Africa.
Yeah.
Been there a few times before, but the journey from Cape Town to, say, to Stellenbosch, the difference in the standard of living of people within that 40-minute ride is very difficult to understand. And it hits, you can't avoid it, but hit you in the face and make you question all sorts of things, such as inequalities back at home.
Yes, as I said, I think when I was referring earlier and I said, look, religion, standard of living and weather, obviously standard of living is a big one, and it's easy to go somewhere where the standard of living universally is higher or lower than your own. I agree with you, it's very difficult when you see massive changes in a very short distance, and it's unhealthy. It leads to instability, jealousy, and it shouldn't happen. I agree with you.
I want to come back to the book, and I want to come back to your journey as a writer and talk about some of your on-screen creations. And also, you mentioned that a producer has optioned this. I wonder how involved, if it does become a film, how involved you would like to be in your own work. But we'll come back to all that, because first of all, one of the fun things about you is all the sort of anecdotes that have accumulated during your life, and they're not everyday anecdotes. It started quite early and involved Winston Churchill.
Yes. I was staying at Tregenna Castle, and I was probably about 4, and they had one of those old lifts, you know, with a chainmail shutting the door and one of those handles. And the guy who was operating it jumped out. And as I jumped in to grab it, this elderly gentleman and his wife got in, and all I heard him say was, "Let's play with this." And we went up and down and up and down and up and down for about 5 minutes. He was having a roaring time, thinking it very funny. And eventually we got to the ground floor, the doors open, and the manager of the hotel was just taking a deep breath to give me an absolute bollocking. And he didn't say anything. and I had no idea. It was only, later in life and everything, my father said to me, that was Winston Churchill you were playing in the lift with. I was lucky with that.
Later on, you turned up in a restaurant, and there was a very famous singer who happened to be there at the same time.
That was
about 25, I think.
I was a bit older. I was actually in Hollywood trying to finance a movie called Canaris, which eventually became Tom Cruise's Valkyrie movie. It was about the assassination of Hitler. And I went to see a guy called Tom McDermott, who looked like someone had inserted a space hopper into him. He had this huge stomach, and he kind of talked like this, kid, And he was a very famous old-time Hollywood producer. He'd been Ronald Reagan's partner. He had discovered Steve McQueen. I mean, he was a smorgasbord of anecdotes. But anyway, he took me to a restaurant called Chasen's, which in those days shut now, but in those days was a very big Hollywood movie star restaurant. Elizabeth Taylor used to get the chili from Chasen's flown out to Rome when she was making Cleopatra. It was one of those places, you know. So anyway, we walk in, and the doorman comes up to my friend, whose name was Tom McDermott, and he goes, Mr. McDermott, you may notice the private dining room is being used. It's Mr. Sinatra. It's his 75th birthday. He saw you came in, and he wondered if you'd like to come and have a drink at the end of your lunch with your colleagues. So Tom McDermott said, show up, but tell Frank I'm bringing my mate, I'm bringing my English friend, great producer, M.N.Grenside. So I'm going, so he goes away, we have lunch, and Tom McDermott said, the only thing is stay cool. Don't be phased by anything. So I went, okay, fine. So we go in, and Sinatra is there, and he gets up, and he says, hi, Tom, Frank, this is Mark, my English friend, and all this stuff. And I go, how'd you do, Mr. Sinatra? How'd you do, Miss Marks? Barbara Marx is his wife, and there was Sammy Davis was there with his Norwegian or Swedish wife or whatever, and there was this huge long table, obviously stuffed with people who were all important, and I had no idea who they were, and I was all going down, and Sinatra was saying, this is Mr. This is Mr. And right at the end of this table was this little bald guy with pebble glasses on, who looked exactly like Mr. Magoo. And I went, but Mr. Magoo was based actually on an agent called Swifty Lazar, who looked like that, who was Bogart's agent, and has long been dead. So I'm going, who is the guy who looks like Mr. Magoo? We get down the end, and Frank Sinatra goes, and this is Max Factor. And I went, Max Factor? There's a Max Factor? And Sinatra turned around and said, hey, Tom, next time you come, don't bring some English faggot who's more interested in Max Factor than Frank Sinatra. So that blew my copybook entirely. But, yeah, there's a Max Factor. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, no. I didn't know that Frank Sinatra was homophobic either until now.
No, he was toshing. He was just saying, you know.
Tell us about another extraordinary meeting as well. A chap who had his legs on the table that you mistook for a driver.
Yes, that was very embarrassing. I was very young. I just started working for Jim Henson, and in fact, his house in London, where we all worked from, because the Muppet Show was shot in the UK.
Did you work with the Muppets?
Yeah.
Having left university and gone into insurance, gone into kidnap insurance and ransom insurance, then you make this rather magical transition to the Muppets.
To the Muppets,
okay, which you can elaborate on in a moment, after you've told the anecdote.
So anyway, we were making a movie at the time called Labyrinth, and Mr. Henson, whose house it was, used to go out to the studio every day, and I came into the office one day, and there was some guy with his boots on my desk, and I thought it was the driver. So I said, excuse me, can I help you? And he's got his cap on and beard and sunglasses. He said, I'm here to see Jim. And I went, it's Mr. Henson to you, because I thought he was the driver for the studio. So I said, could you get your feet off my desk? So he gets up and sits on the chair, and I go upstairs, and Jim's washing his teeth. And I said, Jim, your driver is here. And he goes, I don't have a driver today. And he comes downstairs, and he said, he said, Stephen. And then he turns to me and he says, M.N.Grenside, Steven Spielberg. Right? So I shrank to about that high. But he was very good about it. And 6 months later, I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm at the Beverly Hills Hotel in a queue waiting for a taxi. And I'm standing there, and I hear all this, obviously somebody important was coming along. I turn around, and it's Spielberg. And, everybody's in awe of this guy, and he comes up, taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, I haven't got my chauffeur's cap, but can I give you a lift anywhere? Service in that hotel for me went through the roof. And that was, he was just being genuinely nice guy. And for that, I will always defend any movie that he makes.
Tell us about the process of pitching, because again, in the book, these meta layers, one of the protagonists is trying to pitch movies. He spends a huge amount of money, and you've invested quite a bit of money over your life as well, but he puts this huge amount of money into a film that's bound to be a success. Everyone's very excited, except it turns out that the person who wrote it, I think, was a paedophile.
Yes.
What was it like actually pitching yourself, and how stressful is that, and how tough are the gatekeepers?
The gatekeepers are unbelievably tough. And
you capture that in a scene just before the lift.
It's very, very tough. You have to read the room. You also have to, you're obviously aware of who the people in the room are, but sometimes the decision maker is not the person that you think it is. So you have to be very aware if somebody's nodding off to sleep, you better make sure you wake him up, just in case he's the guy. Pitch meetings, they boil down into really two silos. Silo number one is it's talent driven. So silo number one is I'm just giving a silly example, I've got Tom Cruise, Steven Spielberg, and whoever else you want to throw into the mix, and they want to do a movie. That's one pitch. Okay, and everybody's, what do you think they'd like to do, sort of thing. This is, really simplistic. Or you've got the other pitch, which is, I've got this idea, or I've optioned a book, or I've come up with this fantastic story. You give a quick elevator pitch to it, and then if they bite the idea, then the next question is always, who's going to direct it? Who's going to be the photographer? Who's going to be obviously your main lead? So you've got you have two kinds of pitches, and it's in the book it's very simplistic because you never have one pitch meeting. Certainly in Los Angeles, you never have a bad meeting. It drives you up the wall. Everybody always says yes. It's like being in Japan. So you have several until eventually you realise they're saying no, even though they say yes. And the reason they do that is no one ever wants to be accused of turning down a movie that then became a hit. So we didn't turn it down. You took it away from us, sort of thing. It's quite stressful. I did probably the worst pitch meeting I ever did in my life was with goodness me, sorry. Who's the comedian? English comedian who wrote The Queen, Ben Elton. So Ben Elton wrote a comedy pilot for ABC for us, and it was called Working Hard for the Money, and actually it's a little bit similar to The Shits, or whatever it's called. That basically it was an old guy who had gone bankrupt, and the only thing he owned was an old people's home. And that's where he had to live. And with these young kids were running, the old people's home. Anyhow, it was very funny. And we were doing it through Henry Winkler from the Fonts from Happy Days, who's become a very, very successful producer in his own right now. MacGyver is one of his shows, a very, very successful producer. And he loved this, absolutely loved it, and he said, okay, we're going to take it in. ABC want a new comedy and everything else, and we're all pumped up. This is really exciting. And Ben Elton flies in, we go into this meeting, and the guys look at us and say, the trouble with this is it's too funny. And I thought they were joking. I said, hang on a minute, it's a comedy half hour. How can it be a problem it's too funny? And they were serious. It was too funny and it needed to be darkened down, at which point Ben Elton got up and said, probably the last time I'll ever think about writing a comedy in the United States, and went home. So, extraordinary.
I'm a presenter and also a producer or editor, so quite difficult to look at your own content.
Very.
As with your editor's hat on.
Yeah.
Because none of us want to sort of see fault in ourselves. And
no.
How was the process of looking back on this, and are there lessons that you would learn to import into the next book?
Well, there are basic mistakes that you always make. I say always, that's very presumptuous of me, but a lot of writers that I know on their first attempts at writing, you overwrite. You always overwrite. So I've probably learnt a bit from that. Editing is ruthless. And there are scenes that I had to cut out of that I literally cried as I hit the delete button.
Killing your own babies.
It's drowning your own babies. But I was very lucky in that I'd been through that process on film, and I'd seen scenes that a director had said, it's got to go. And I've said, no, and they're right. So it wasn't quite as painful and traumatic as I think it is for other writers.
And if it does become a movie,
yeah,
do you want to be involved? And are you pleased with how you wrote it from that sense? Because obviously, first and foremost, it's a novel. But did you have in your mind the idea that one day a screenwriter, whether you or someone else, would want to put it on the screen?
Yeah, I mean, as you very kindly said, it's written in a very filmic way. And I hope that makes it an easy read. It's quite a complex story, but it's actually quite easy to read. It would never be a movie. It would be an 8-hour or a 10-hour for Amazon or Hulu or whatever. I've made the mistake of trying to make books both as films and for TV. And then when I was doing it, the longest format in those days was something called a mini-series, which was 2 times 90 minutes. I did an Arthur Heller book. He wrote Hotel. I did The Detective. I did a whole load of Patricia Highsmith novels, and it is nearly impossible. The only format that really works for books is this new format that's been created by essentially the Davids to the Goliaths, the Netflix, the Hulus. They've created this new format, which is an 8-hour story arc. And that works for books. And if I can digress here for a minute, one of my favourite books recently was the story of Elizabeth Holmes, who was the woman who created the Emperor's New Clothes that was Theranos, which was a company that went from $0 to $9 billion value. They were saying that a prick of blood in your finger and they could instantly read it, all right? And Murdoch put in $125 million and then the whole thing went bust. Now, the book about the story was written by a guy called John Carreyrou, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. The book is sensational. And when I read it and I gave it to my wife to read, I said, this is going to be the best miniseries in reality miniseries. And sure enough, Disney did it for Hulu. It's 10 hours, and Amanda Seyfried, or I can never pronounce her name, is wonderful as Amanda Holmes. But at the same time, Jennifer Lawrence is doing it as a 2.5-hour movie. I guarantee you the miniseries on Hulu will be better.
Where do you see cinema now? We've had the pandemic and the success of series, box sets, whatever you want to call them, has been astonishing in recent years, to the extent that many of the big Hollywood A-listers seem to have found their homes, but perhaps not second homes, first homes now, in that genre. What is the future for the shorter form, as you see it?
I have a slightly controversial view as to the future of cinema. I think cinema, as I grew up and knew it, is dead. I think what's happening is there is going to be the spectacle, and the spectacle is going to grow and grow, so that whether it's Men in Spandex or whether it's Star Wars or any of those big event movies, I think are going to move out of cinemas. I think they're going to move into rock stadiums. I think they will have massive sound systems. I think they will run for 2 or 3 weeks. The tickets will be $150 a crack, and they will have extras. They will build stuff from the actual movie, and it will be a massive, massive event.
Has this started to happen, or is it?
It's starting to happen. They're doing it retroactively. There's a company here in the UK that does it for Bond movies and 1 or 2 things like that, and you can go to these events dressed as James Bond or whatever. And that's beginning to start, and that's where I think it's going. I think the 2-hour movie that we grew up on as a format is falling away. I do not think now that All About Eve, even The Godfather, The Conversation, any of the great movies that we grew up with would be commissioned now. But they would be commissioned as event television. I could see All About Eve being remade over 8 to 10 hours. And I think that's a good thing. I think the Academy, or the Oscars as they're more commonly known, are making a massive mistake in not recognising television as an award-winning category, because the best writers in the world, I can tell you, are all writing for television. They're not writing for feature film.
This is a slightly more nuanced question, but do you think that the way series are going to be made moving forwards will change, given that the way we consume series has changed within itself? So just for example, I mean, there was I can't remember the name of it, but it was Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant. I thought it was a very good series.
Yeah, it was a very good series.
Not so long ago. I think it was on Sky Atlantic.
Yeah.
And for some reason, you were only able to watch that every Monday.
Yeah. It drives you mad.
Yeah, wasn't good. There's a special excitement about it. It becomes a sort of event within the household, but it's very, very rare for that to be the case anymore. Most things you can binge watch, and people do binge watch. Will that, do you think, or has it already changed the way even that series are made?
I would suggest that a lot of people who watch that will remember it in a minute, but it was a very, very good series. I would suggest that at least 50% of them waited for the bloody thing to finish and then watched it all in one go or in their own time frame. I think the idea of weekly date viewing is dead.
Because it was the last of the water cooler thing, wasn't it? Because the way that we consume TV is so different. But those where you still had to wait, that was the last moment where people could kind of get around and experience. And then they tweet about it as well with social media, and everyone would talk about it when it came out. Line of Duty was similar.
No, it was. I just think it's a dying. I think people wish to arrange their own entertainment time on their own schedule. And I think what you're going to see is that less and less series will come in once a week. Of course, from a producer's point of view, it's a nightmare, because if you're making for US network television, you'd be making 22 episodes a year. So if you're making network television, you're delivering mostly in autumn, and you start shooting in spring, you are being paid for the first episodes as you're still editing and shooting the last. So your cash flow position is much healthier than if you have to shoot a whole load of episodes and then get paid when you deliver them, all in one chunk. You've added probably 4 months to your cash flow drawback, which is a problem. But I think it's the way it's all going to go. I mean, I personally think that the channel business, any channel business, is over. I think Sky's business plan is finished. I think terrestrial broadcasters will survive on weekly broadcasts, but I think everything else is going to go out the window. I think the consumer is going to say, I'm not interested in Netflix, Hulu, Disney, this, that, and the other. I just want to access silos where there is shows that I want to watch. And I think the one thing, the piece that's missing that is going to come is you are going to have a much better selector of programs than you do now, which is having to scroll through pages and pages. I think with the data that's out there and it's being collected, I think if you come in one evening, sit in front of the television, you voice activate it to turn on, and you go, I'd like to see a Bond movie, for example. And it will come back and will say, Matthew, there were 28 Bond movies by now. The one that you saw the longest ago was You Only Live Twice, which you haven't seen for 15 years. However, here are 5 similar movies that you've never seen. That's all you want. It's like going into a restaurant. I'm not interested in the ingredients.
Scrolling is...
I'm not interested. It's a complete waste of time.
It's something from yesterday still.
Yes, but what will happen is, as I said, it's like going into a restaurant. They tell you everything that's in the cupboard. You want a short menu. I don't want to know everything. What will happen is that you will start paying, whether it's 50p a month or whatever, to an aggregator that is really accurate. Because if you've got a service that whatever you want to watch, whether you want to feel like a documentary or this, that and the other, and they can filter hundreds of pages down to 4 or 5 choices, I will pay that 50p a month in a heartbeat. Now, what's going to happen is those guys are going to be the gatekeepers, because what they will do is when the studios have pitched an idea for a show, they will be able to feed it into the algorithms, and they'll be able to say, that show is going to generate $20 million an hour.
Or they'll say there's already something too similar to
and
that.
Forget it. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that is always going to be good, but if you ask me where the future of television is going, it's going to one big hopper that has everything in it, no channels, and you will be paying for a really good aggregation.
What will that do you anticipate, for diversity, for creativity, for being original?
Well, obviously,
would it bring everything more together, or would it allow for greater choice?
I think the more information you have, the more diverse you can make the programming. I think the problem at the moment is that most broadcasters are incredibly, whatever they say to you, they're incredibly insular in their view of their audience, to the extent that sometimes they say, I'm not interested in people over 50 because of my advertisers. Well, I mean, it's the dumbest thing anybody can say to you. You know, let me tell you, if I'd rather have some esoteric programming, or I had owned Murder, She Wrote, I know I'd kind of like to own Murder, She Wrote. That isn't to say that programming is all going to be bland. It isn't. The more data that you can get, the more risky you can be with programming. It's just a function of budget. It's not a function of whether the show can be commissioned or not. So if there's a small area of programming that appeals to a diverse or a minority group, if you've got 100 million people in your pot, you sure as hell know that you can hit 15, 20, I mean, whatever the number is, and you know what they're going to pay for that, so you know that you can commission it. I think that's what's going to happen.
How do these changes take place? Does someone like you, or even more powerful than you, sit up there and say, this is the future and I'm going to make it happen now? Or do they happen incrementally?
I think they'll be driven by technology. I think the only reason the studios still cling on to supplying Sky movies is that they're all rewarded on an annual basis on the annual revenue they generate, and they all make their bonuses. But anyone with a clear head is going to say, what is the point in letting Sky share 50% of my pay-per-view revenue when I can do it myself? The only difference is you don't get an advance. And eventually that will get through. And as I said, I think that the real changer will be when you are able to be offered a service that will deliver to you programming that really does appeal to you and all the tastes that you have, that will deliver that, and you pay for that. Once that happens, I think the rest will turn around. I don't think the studios are going to do it. I think technology is going to do it. I mean, I know Murdoch has, whatever you think about him, I mean, he's invested $300 million into companies that can take your viewing history and tailor much more exactly what you like to watch. There's nothing Orwellian about that.
It's already happening to an extent, isn't it? When you log into Netflix.
Yeah. And so have you tried this?
Right, or promote things, and of course with Google and its algorithms.
Yeah.
If you put the same phrase into Google that I do, we get different results based on our history.
Yes, I just don't think it's drilled down and focused enough for entertainment, but I think it is coming. I think it will offer a lot more programming. I think that funnily enough, the cutting-edge programming that for a while moved to cable and satellite and Netflix and everything else, whether it was Breaking Bad or whatever, funnily enough, I think those programs might shift back towards the few terrestrial broadcasters who are left in place, because they probably won't avail themselves to the services of the analyticals because they're terrestrial broadcasters. I can see that happening, but I think television will increase, and certainly I've talked about entertainment, but to me, the finest entertainment in the world at the moment is television, and has been for the last 10 years. Ever since The Sopranos, it's changed.
So as someone, Mark, who's worked in lots of different roles and had experience of different genres as well, could you explain to us the creative differences, I mean, beyond the obvious, of a director and a screenwriter? How often is one person capable of both of those things? And are they fundamentally different skills, do you think?
Yes, fundamentally very different, and fundamentally very different in importance on the media that you're working in. Essentially, if you're working in television as a media, and certainly if you're doing multiple episodes, which most high-quality television is, you're employing a number of directors.
Yeah.
Because if you're shooting 8 episodes, you've probably got one director prepping 2, you've got one shooting 2, you've got one editing 2. So you're going to have 5 directors or 4 directors on an 8-series shoot. So on television, just because of that, those directors do not have any of the power that a director on a feature film would. Mr. Spielberg runs the set. That's it. Because of who he is.
So who runs the deal when you've got So that Jamie Dornan series, did you see it set in the Outback, for example, recently?
It was quite fun.
Yeah, and different directors.
Yeah.
Quite, I imagine, challenging is for whoever is in charge
to corral them.
Yeah, to corral them and to retain the flow.
So
and also make sure their egos don't explode.
Yeah, well, that's always
so take it off in some.
What used to happen, and I need to say this, and then I'll change it to what is happening. What used to happen is the producers of the shows would control the running of a series. Now, when I say the producer, I don't mean the actual guy who's on the set, right? The guy who's on the set is just running the non-creative side of what's happening. The director runs the creative side. I'm talking about what would be an executive producer. Used to sit on the top of this thing, and if it was Aaron Spelling or any of those guys that you can remember from the 70s and 80s, Quinn Martin, all those guys, right?
Or Harvey Weinstein before ever.
Not quite, because Harvey didn't write anything. Right. Quinn Martin and those guys used to write a bit. But essentially they were producers. They would go in, they'd have an output deal, i.e. they'd have a deal at CBS, NBC, ABC, that they would have either a guaranteed pilot would get picked up every year out of 5, or, and that's how it worked, and that's how it trundled along. Now, where everything changed was when television grew up, and I've got nothing against Dallas and Dynasty, but when we moved from that to The Sopranos and to The West Wing, a new person was born, and that person is the showrunner. Now, the showrunner is by far the most powerful person in television, and by far the richest. There are more billionaires in television than there are in feature film. And the reason is that the really good showrunners like Sandra Rhimes is fantastic, Mark Cherry, there's a bunch of them who you'll regularly see as created by or, executive produced and created by. Those guys run the roost now. Now, what those guys do is they are in a position where they creatively put together the package to start with, so they may think up the show. They will probably write the pilot themselves. They'll gather around them a team of writers that will do the rest, and they will essentially own and control the show. And they're so powerful, there's about 20 of them now. They run the roost on all television, whether they're working at the networks, whether they're working at HBO and Showtime.
Do they get their hands dirty?
Yes.
They say, I don't like that scene, or I need something different?
Yes, that's because they run the show, they're showrunners. And they make quantitudinous amounts of money. I mean, I got nothing against them making a lot of money, but money in Hollywood, like a lot of businesses, is the yardstick of power. And those guys... I mean, if Sandra Rhimes, I can't remember who she has a deal with now. I can't remember if I think it's now Netflix she has a deal. But were she to walk out of Netflix and go to Hulu, she would probably be offered $250,000 just to walk out the door.
Are the Broccolis, are they showrunners?
No, they're not. I mean, Barbara Broccoli, who now runs the Bond thing, yes, I suppose they're old-time producers. They sit on top of this franchise that they own and control, but she's not creative at all. She wouldn't write a script or a screenplay. Yes, I'm sure that when Martin Campbell or whoever it is, or whoever the two guys who've been writing them all for the last 10 years, whenever they present the screenplay, of course she approves it, works with Daniel Craig or whoever it was. But she's not a creative producer.
So these showrunners, were they creative producers beforehand?
Yes.
Or screenwriters?
Most of them were writers.
Right.
And they were abused appallingly. I mean, during the 30s and 40s, the writers were incredibly badly paid. They were always the bottom of the heap, and yet without them you wouldn't have anything. Now what's happened is the value of these shows, if they're a hit, is so phenomenally eye-watering that whichever studio and or network is employing them, and if they can deliver that hit, they have complete control. I mean, not all of them, but I mean, you would not tell Sandra Rhimes anything about how to run her shows.
I'm interested in that word control for you, because you've had a lot of power in your career.
Yeah.
But you take risks as well.
Yeah.
So in your personal life, you go scuba diving. As I said, you jump out of airplanes. You got your scuba diving license when you were 16, I think. How in control, we talked about collaboration, but how in control do you feel putting something like this out into the world? Because you really are vulnerable to reaction, aren't you?
Yeah. But that's part of the game. If you put yourself out there, you can't expect not to get knocked. I mean, that's the game. When I'm talking about control, in that case, I controlled the book. I'm the actor, writer, director, editor, the whole damn shoot. That's me. Once it's finished, you put it out into the public and they either like it or they loathe it. That's life.
Could you talk to us briefly about your attitude to risk? Because you risk money, you put major investments into things.
Yep.
You risk your life in a sense. I'm sure scuba diving's not that dangerous, but it's not something I would choose to do, and I wouldn't jump out of aeroplanes. Talk to us about how you've combined risk with being successful, and could you have had the success you've had so far without risk?
No. Risk, it's yin and yang, isn't it? It's risk and reward. I mean, there are some incredibly lucky, talented people, whether they're musicians or writers or businessmen or whatever, who are always going to be successful because they've got an IQ that makes ours look pathetic. And they probably don't risk as much financially. Maybe they do emotionally, and maybe they risk it professionally, but financially they probably don't. But most of us out there, we all take risks, every day. It's just a sliding scale of what that risk is. Every time you walk out the door, you could get COVID or you get hit by the omnibus. I mean, it's people's propensity and ability to accept risk that separates people. I mean, I've always been an arrogant little so-and-so, so I always believed that if I took a risk and it was calculated, that it would work out. But the truth of the matter is, risk takers only have to bat at 51%. That's it. You can't always get it right. I mean, I think people who take risks and always expect all of them to work out are very quickly disillusioned. It's being able to pick yourself up after you've had a catastrophe and just say, well...
I'm curious as well as the spillover of your creativity and the entertainer in you from your professional life to your private life. So as a presenter and a performer, I don't know whether that's linked to the fact that I love hosting dinner parties.
I love it.
Terrible name dropping, but I had quite a nervous moment on Friday because my girlfriend couldn't make it to the dinner party, and I was therefore having to cook for Ian Hislop and Victoria Hislop. And they both had seconds of my roast chicken. This was a great moment in my life, even though it was nothing to do with my professional life. But you love hosting dinner parties, and unlike me, you're a really good cook. So I wonder whether the entertainer in you and the creative finds a voice in your personal life as well.
Yeah, cooking is absolutely a path that I use for creativity. I also love company. I talk far too much, as you can tell, but I love being surrounded by friends and family. And I was, this is a little segue, but I was very lucky. When I went to work for Jim Henson, it was at the height of his fame, and he could never go to a restaurant with anybody because the next day it would be, they're going to be on the Muppet Show. And he hated that. And so I did a deal with him. And I said, look, I'll tell you what, Jim, I'll cook. And you can bring Sylvester Stallone, Roger Moore, whoever you like to the house. I'll cook. And this is the deal. You will never argue on the wine bill, and I will never charge you for my labour of doing the cooking.
You must be a seriously good cook.
Oh, well, I wasn't that good, but the booze was great. And for about 4 years, not all the time, but he would ring up and say, look, I'm bringing XYZ, to dinner. Is that okay? And I'd say, God, if you must.
Well, come on then. I've done Ian Hislop. You've raised me Sylvester Stallone.
Yeah.
Give us some examples of the people who come round for dinner and what they were like. And were they very different to how you expected them to be?
If you're famous, if you become famous very young, I can't remember who it was who said it, but you have to give that person 4 years grace. Because you suddenly go from, not being able to pay a compliment to enormous wealth, power, and everybody surrounding you telling you you're a genius. So it's very unfair to judge young actors and young talent. But there are some people who, as they get older, are still a pain in the neck. And there are some people who they get older are charming. I mean, I had Donald Sutherland, and he's a very demanding, tough guy, and he's quite difficult to work with on the set. But for dinner, he's absolutely brilliant, and he's great fun. So you're never quite sure. I remember when I was in LA, I cooked dinner for, oh my goodness, Steve, whatever his name was, from Police Academy in Cocoon.
Can anyone help us out?
Steve, anyhow. And he was a very successful guy, been in Diner, made some movies for us actually when I was at RHI, came for dinner, lovely guy. Absolutely lovely guy. Really wanted to be a dentist, lucked out, and he said, you know what, I'm lucky and I'm grateful, and I'm not a great actor, but I've made a shed load of money out of doing it. I cannot understand other people who think they're super talented. Everybody's reasonably talented, and yet bite the hands that feed them. But a lot of people do. Hollywood is full of people who are difficult to work with, whose career disappears. Look at Faye Dunaway. I mean, just disappeared. Edward Norton disappeared because they're just difficult. That doesn't mean they're unpleasant. They're just difficult people. And, I remember Henry Winkler told me about the guy who plays MacGyver, whatever his name is, right? That Henry got him for nothing because it was his first show. And MacGyver ran for 6 years. And the first 2 years they worked in Canada. And he said, this guy who played MacGyver, whatever his name was, was an angel to work with. The show was a hit. He had no ego at all. By the time we were in season 3, he said, listen, could I have a ticket for my wife to come and see me because she's about to give birth? And Henry went, what do you mean? Yeah, you could have told us, we could have changed the shooting. Oh, I didn't want to disturb everybody. And Henry said, 5 years later when I was going to do Stargate, which was his film, his TV show, he put the guy from MacGyver back in it. Not because he was a great actor, but he just said he was so easy to work with.
A huge lesson there.
Yeah, be nice.
You're wondering why my career has nosedived for a long time.
Oh, I don't even have one. I'm far too rude to everybody. But I being nice doesn't hurt anybody.
No. And you notice them as a young producer working at the BBC.
Yes.
I would notice people like Alicia Dixon and Mylene Klass, who did or didn't have particular talent, but they were absolutely and relentlessly lovely.
Yeah.
And you wanted to work with them.
Yeah.
You tell other people that they were lovely.
Yeah.
Final 2 quick questions, because we have to stop. One, what was the Muppets like to work on?
A joy. A joy. It was, at the time, it was the most popular show in the world. And I was a very junior person associated with it. And it was great. But I know we're running out of time, but I think people don't understand how clever Henson was. The follow-up show and the previous show was obviously Sesame Street, still running. The following show was Fraggle Rock. Now, if you ever saw Fraggle Rock is a jigsaw show. Now, people never understand this, but Fraggle Rock, the segment that takes place underground, is all puppets, no lip sync problem, it's very easy to dub. The element where the character Gobo, which is an in-joke because it's a light in filming terms, when he comes out of the hole and he sees the old man with the dog, in the UK, it's Fulton Mackinac Lighthouse. But in the US, it's a beachcomber. In France, he's a chef. In Germany, he runs a garage. Now, when you sew the two together, even though you've only, out of a 22-minute show, you've only had 3 minutes live in that country. Once you sew it together, you ask a kid about Fraggle Rock in France, he won't believe you for a minute that it wasn't a French show. And he was a genius at that.
Related question, quickly to squeeze in.
Sorry.
A career highlight of mine, I used to do a series called 5 Minutes With at the BBC, where they interview famous people in exactly 5 minutes. And I sent to New York, amazing, when the BBC had budgets to interview Sesame Street. So I interviewed Big Bird and all these guys and Oscar
Carol
the Grouch.
Spinney.
But one of the things that was sort of stuck with me about that was the way they worked, and it was so unionised. People weren't allowed to lift a table at a certain point because it was lunchtime or whatever. Have you noticed, working around the world, very different ways of treating people and working?
I'll give you a great example. First series I produced myself. I did a series about William Tell called Crossbow. We did 72 episodes, which is quite a lot. And it was shot in English, and it was the precursor of Xena and Hercules and all those shows. But we shot it in France, and we had an unbelievably good deal, but obviously all the actors were American or English. And for the first few episodes, that Anthony Horowitz, it was the first thing that Anthony Horowitz ever wrote. They wanted a shit-hot director for the first few shows, so they sent over some guy who had made his bones on the original Hawaii Five-0, and he turns up, and everything's ready to go, and he comes up to me and he said, Mark, there's alcohol at lunch. I said, you're in France. He said, no, I can't work with alcohol in France. Either the alcohol goes or I go. He was gone.
Really?
Yeah. You want to tell a crew of 120 in France they're not having red wine with their pâté for lunch? You've got to be crazy. I'd have had a strike on my hands.
And he went. He
went, and the only people who ever got drunk were actors. The crew never got drunk, ever.
How funny. Okay, final question. Of all the things you've done, and you run a CBD business, and you've done all the investments I've talked about, and you've made series and so on and so forth, is there a sort of strange sense in which, not strange, but is there a sense in which just having your book, your first novel, with your name on it, out there, is that a very special thing?
It's a huge thrill.
Yeah.
It's a huge thrill. I mean, it's ego unbounded, but I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful feeling, and hopefully people read it and they enjoy it. That's great. Just to have achieved it's anybody who's a writer, you're the same. Just to actually get it out there and get somebody to print it.
Well, it says you had a lot of fun with it as well. There was a lot of dialogue, and again, from the screenwriter, you could sort of see that. Well, look, I strongly recommend getting a copy if you haven't already, and you'll sign copies.
Yes, of course I will.
Well. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your afternoon with us, and thank you very much indeed, in particular to you, Mark, for coming all the way from Malta as well to do it. So
it was an honour. Thank you
very much.
Please thank
Mark very much.